The city buzzed faintly in the distance. Its bright lights and restless energy dimmed in the quiet parking lot of a closed supermarket. A gentle rain had begun to fall, making the cracked asphalt shimmer under the flickering glow of a solitary streetlight. Amid the cold and damp, a figure moved stealthily unnoticed. A boy barely 14, with a wiry frame and sharp, observant eyes. William, as he called himself, had no family and no home. The streets were his world, and survival was his skill. That night, William had been searching for a dry corner to rest when the sight of a luxury car caught his eye. The vehicle's sleek lines and polished surface hinted at the kind of wealth he could only dream about. But it wasn't the car itself that intrigued him. It was the two people standing beside it, locked in a tense and hurried conversation. The woman stood tall, her silhouette elegant and poised. She wore a fitted trench coat, its fabric unblemished by the rain. Her hair was perfectly styled, and even in the dim light, her diamond earrings glittered faintly. Beside her was a man, broad-shouldered and dressed more casually, though his leather jacket and expensive watch suggested he was no stranger to luxury either. William crouched behind a nearby dumpster, his heart pounding. He had learned the hard way not to meddle in the lives of people far removed from his own struggles, but something about their hushed tones and furtive glances drew him in. He crept closer, moving silently across the wet ground, until he was near enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "It's all set," the woman said in a low, clipped voice. "Michael leaves early tomorrow morning. He's taking the car to the meeting." The man nodded, his expression hard. "And the brakes? Already handled. By the time he realizes something's wrong, it'll be too late." William froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea who Michael was, but the tone of their conversation left little room for doubt. They were planning something sinister. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to leave this dangerous knowledge behind, but his feet refused to move. "This has to look like an accident," the man added, his voice edged with steel. "No mistakes, Rachel." "I know," the woman replied, her voice calm but determined. "Once it's done, everything will be ours." They exchanged a brief, conspiratorial glance before the man leaned against the car and crossed his arms. "And no one suspects a thing?" Rachel smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Michael trusts me. He's so busy with his empire, he doesn't see what's right in front of him." Her words were laced with contempt, and William's stomach churned. Whoever this Michael was, he didn't deserve what they were planning. But what could he do? He was just a kid, a nobody. If he confronted them, they'd laugh or worse. As Rachel and the man, Terry as she called him, wrapped up their conversation, William slipped back into the shadows. He watched as they parted ways, Rachel driving off in the sleek car and Terry disappearing into the night. Alone again, William leaned against the cold, damp wall of the supermarket and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He didn't know Michael or where to find him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something. He had no family, no ties, but he still understood what it meant to lose everything. He couldn't let that happen to someone else. For the rest of the night, William followed Rachel's car through the city streets. He kept his distance, using his street-hardened instincts to stay out of sight while staying close enough not to lose her. The houses grew larger and more extravagant the further they drove, until Rachel finally turned down a wide, tree-lined road. At the end of the street stood an imposing mansion, its tall iron gates gleaming in the rain. William stopped at the edge of the property, staring in awe at the massive house. He had never seen anything so grand. Lights illuminated the driveway, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. It was a stark contrast to the bleakness of his own life, but the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by the weight of what he had overheard. Somewhere inside that house, Michael slept, unaware of the danger that awaited him. William clenched his fists, shivering as the rain soaked through his hoodie. He didn't know how he would get inside or what he would say, but one thing was clear. He had to warn Michael before it was too late. The cold rain had turned to mist by the time William managed to summon the courage to approach the mansion. The towering iron gates seemed impenetrable, but he spotted a side entrance, small and unguarded, likely meant for service staff. The boy slipped through, his thin frame easily fitting between the bars. Creeping across the expansive lawn, he marveled at the opulence surrounding him. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the driveway, and a fountain sat at the center, its cascading water glinting faintly in the moonlight. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of wealth, the kind of place he'd never dared to imagine himself near. Yet here he was, a boy from the streets, on a mission to save a man he'd never met. William pressed himself against the cool stone of the mansion's walls, searching for an entry point. A large window near the back of the house was slightly ajar, its heavy curtains swaying gently in the night breeze. He hoisted himself up, wincing as his damp sneakers squeaked against the sill, and slipped inside. The interior was even more intimidating than the exterior. Marble floors gleamed beneath ornate chandeliers, and the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne hung in the air. Every corner seemed to radiate sophistication and power. But William didn't have time to marvel. He needed to find Michael. Navigating the mansion was no easy task. The hallways were labyrinthine, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through him. He passed rooms filled with priceless artwork, grand pianos, and walls lined with books that looked untouched. The life lived here seemed far removed from his reality, yet it felt oddly hollow, as if the grandeur masked something missing. Finally, he spotted light spilling from beneath a heavy wooden door at the end of a corridor. Gathering his courage, he approached and knocked tentatively. "Come in," called a deep voice, sharp and commanding. William pushed the door open to find himself in a lavish study. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a massive oak desk stood at the center, papers neatly arranged in stacks. Behind the desk sat a man in his early 40s, his tailored suit impeccable even at this late hour. His sharp features and piercing eyes gave him an air of authority, but there was a weariness in his posture, a subtle slouch that hinted at long hours and heavy burdens. The man looked up, startled to see a soaking wet teenager standing in his study. His expression quickly shifted to suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, rising from his chair. "And how did you get in here?" William hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze, the judgment in his eyes. This was the moment he had dreaded, the moment he would have to make Michael believe him. "My name is William," he stammered, wringing his hands. I need to tell you something. It's important." Michael's eyes narrowed. "You broke into my home to tell me something? You have 5 seconds to explain yourself before I call security." William stepped forward, his voice trembling but resolute. "Your life is in danger. Your wife, Rachel, she's planning to kill you. She and a man named Terry have tampered with the brakes on your car. They're trying to make it look like an accident." The room fell silent, the weight of William's words hanging heavily in the air. Michael stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea how absurd that sounds?" he said finally, his tone cold. "Rachel is my wife. She's been by my side for years. And Terry, my brother? He's family. Why would they do something like that?" William took a shaky breath. "I don't know why. I just know what I heard. They were in the parking lot near the supermarket. They didn't see me, but I heard everything. They said you'd be dead by tomorrow." Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by anger. "You expect me to believe this story from a kid who broke into my house?" he said, his voice rising. "Do you even know who I am? Do you have any idea how much I've worked for this life? My wife and brother wouldn't betray me. They wouldn't." William stepped closer, desperation etched on his face. "Please just check your car. If I'm lying, you'll see. But if I'm telling the truth, it could save your life." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. He glanced at the boy, his clothes soaked and his eyes filled with urgency, and for a brief moment, doubt gnawed at him. Could it be possible? Could the people closest to him harbor such treachery? Reluctantly, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number. "George," he said curtly when the call connected. "I need you to inspect my car tonight. Check everything, especially the brakes. And let me know if you find anything unusual." Hanging up, he turned back to William. "You stay here," he ordered. "If this is some kind of prank, I swear." "It's not a prank," William interrupted. "I swear I'm telling the truth." Michael studied him for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair near the desk. "If you're lying, you'll answer to the police. If you're not, well, we'll see." The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence as they waited for George to report back. William sat nervously, his wet clothes leaving a small puddle on the floor. Michael paced the room, his sharp features betraying his inner turmoil. Finally, the phone buzzed. Michael snatched it up, his voice terse. "What did you find?" There was a pause, then a low voice on the other end of the line. As Michael listened, his expression darkened. His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Thank you," he said curtly, ending the call. He turned to William, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "The brakes were tampered with," he said slowly. "You were right." Relief washed over William, but it was short-lived. The danger wasn't over, not yet. Michael's jaw tightened, and a dangerous gleam appeared in his eyes. "If they want a game, they'll get one. But on my terms." The boy's warning had given him a chance to act, but how he would confront the betrayal that cut deeper than any plot could was a question he wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. Together, they began to plan their next move, the first rays of dawn creeping through the study's grand windows. The first light of dawn spilled over the city, painting the mansion's marble facade in soft gold. Inside, Michael stood at the window of his study, his reflection barely visible against the growing light. His world had always been a fortress of control. Every contract, every business deal, every step forward meticulously planned. But now, cracks had formed in that fortress, and the realization that betrayal was lurking in his own home left him shaken. Behind him, William sat on the edge of a plush leather chair, his damp hoodie dripping onto the expensive carpet. He looked out of place in the lavish surroundings, but his presence was a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Michael's life had been saved by the unlikeliest of allies, a boy from the streets. "Tell me everything you heard," Michael said, his voice calm but tight with barely restrained fury. William nodded, recounting every detail of the conversation between Rachel and Terry. He described their expressions, their confident laughter, the way they spoke of Michael as if he were already gone. As he spoke, Michael's fists clenched, his mind racing. Every detail matched the people he thought he knew best. Rachel's ability to mask her emotions, Terry's relentless ambition. When William finished, the room fell silent. Michael turned away, his jaw tight as he struggled to reconcile this revelation with the life he thought he had built. For years, Rachel had been his partner, his confidant. She had stood by his side through every triumph and challenge, her elegance and poise complementing his drive. And Terry, his younger brother, had been his shadow, his trusted ally. Michael had always believed that their bond, though occasionally strained, was unbreakable. Yet now the evidence was undeniable. "They're not just after my money," Michael muttered, more to himself than to William. "They're after everything. My name, my legacy. They want to erase me." William watched him carefully. "What are you going to do?" Michael turned, his eyes blazing with a determination that was almost frightening. "We're going to make them think their plan is working." "What do you mean?" William asked, his brow furrowed. Michael walked to his desk, pulling out a sleek leather notebook. Inside were meticulous notes, contacts, and plans, his empire condensed into a few pages. He began writing quickly, his movements sharp and precise. "If we confront them now, they'll deny everything. They'll claim innocence, and without hard proof, it's their word against yours." "But you have proof," William said, gesturing toward the call from George. "Not enough," Michael replied. "Tampered brakes could be explained away as sabotage by a rival, or even an accident. To expose them, I need them to reveal themselves completely." William frowned. "And how do you do that?" Michael looked up, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. by letting them think they've won. Michael's plan began to take shape as the morning unfolded. First, he called George again, instructing him to repair the brakes but leave subtle evidence of tampering that could be revealed later. He then contacted a trusted private investigator to begin tailing Rachel and Terry, documenting their movements and conversations. Every detail would be logged, every meeting captured. William listened intently as Michael outlined the steps, his respect for the man growing with each word. Despite the betrayal, Michael's mind was clear, focused on ensuring justice rather than acting on raw emotion. "Here's where you come in," Michael said, turning to William. "You're the only witness to their conversation. I need you to stick around, to observe, to listen. They'll underestimate you. People like Rachel and Terry don't see someone like you as a threat." William hesitated. "What if they figure out I'm helping you?" "They won't," Michael said firmly. "And I won't let anything happen to you. You saved my life, William. Now I'll protect yours." As the day progressed, Michael maintained the facade of normalcy. At breakfast, he greeted Rachel with his usual charm, complimenting her on her dress and discussing mundane topics like their upcoming dinner party. Rachel played her role flawlessly, smiling and laughing as if nothing was amiss. But Michael noticed the small things, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the way she avoided direct answers when he asked about her plans for the day. By the afternoon, Terry arrived at the mansion, as he often did, under the pretense of discussing business. Michael welcomed him warmly, but his mind was focused on the private investigator's updates. Through subtle questioning, Michael learned that Terry had spent the morning at a bank, likely preparing for the next phase of their plan. Meanwhile, William remained hidden, observing from the shadows. His small stature and street-honed stealth made him nearly invisible in the sprawling mansion. He listened to every word, noting every suspicious glance between Rachel and Terry. By evening, the tension in the mansion was palpable. Michael had insisted on hosting a dinner for Rachel and Terry, feigning a celebratory mood. The dining room was a masterpiece of elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting soft light over the polished table. Rachel, dressed in an emerald gown, was the picture of grace. Terry, in a tailored suit, exuded confidence. But as the meal progressed, Michael subtly steered the conversation into dangerous territory. "Tomorrow's meeting is crucial," he said, cutting into his steak. "I'll be driving myself, of course. I want to clear my head before the negotiations." Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her wineglass, but she recovered quickly. "That sounds like a good idea," she said, her voice steady. Terry nodded, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Smart move. It's always good to have a moment of peace before big decisions." Michael caught the flicker of satisfaction in Terry's eyes and felt his stomach churn. They still thought their plan was intact. As the dinner ended, Rachel and Terry excused themselves, claiming exhaustion. Michael watched them leave, his mind racing. He knew the next 24 hours would be critical. Later that night, William met Michael in the study, where they reviewed the day's findings. The private investigators' reports were already damning. Photos of Rachel meeting Terry in secluded spots, phone records showing frequent, encrypted calls between the two. But Michael wanted more. "Tomorrow we'll finish this," Michael said, his voice resolute. "I'll follow their plan, but only to a point. When the moment comes, they'll realize just how wrong they were to underestimate me." William nodded, his admiration for Michael growing. "I'll do whatever you need." Michael placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression softening. "You've already done more than enough. But stay close. This isn't over yet." As the clock struck midnight, the mansion stood silent, its grand halls filled with shadows. Michael and William prepared for the final act, knowing that the coming day would determine everything: betrayal, justice, and survival. The morning dawned cold and crisp, the kind of day that felt alive with possibility and danger. Michael sat in his car, hands gripping the leather steering wheel, the familiar hum of the engine reverberating through the garage. From the outside, it looked like any other day, but beneath the surface, every moment had been meticulously planned. He glanced at the small device concealed in the car's dashboard camera. The private investigator had installed it the night before, ensuring that every moment of this fateful drive would be recorded. Behind the scenes, another car trailed him discreetly, ready to intervene if needed. He was alone in the vehicle but not unprotected. The door to the garage opened, flooding the space with light. Rachel stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, her face a mask of calm. She leaned against the frame, her smile practiced but brittle. "Drive safe, darling," she said, her tone laced with an undercurrent of something darker. "I'll see you tonight." Michael forced a smile. "Of course. Don't wait up." He shifted into gear and pulled out of the driveway, his heart pounding. As he drove through the quiet streets of the affluent neighborhood, his mind replayed every detail of Rachel and Terry's plan. The brakes were supposed to fail as he approached the highway, where speed and traffic would ensure a fatal accident. Meanwhile, William stood hidden in the mansion's expansive gardens, his sharp eyes trained on the house. He had spent the night watching Rachel and Terry, tracking their every move. They had been cautious, whispering in corners and checking their phones repeatedly, but they hadn't suspected him. Now, Rachel was alone in the house, sipping coffee in the sunlit kitchen. Her calm demeanor infuriated William. She acted as though Michael's death was a foregone conclusion, a mere step in her twisted path to power. Terry, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. William suspected he was already positioning himself for the aftermath. But Michael's plan wasn't to wait for the aftermath. It was to control it. As Michael approached the highway, he felt the tension in his chest tighten. He pressed the brakes lightly, testing them, and as expected, they gave no resistance. He clenched his jaw and quickly shifted gears, controlling the car's speed manually. His years of driving luxury vehicles had given him an edge. He knew how to manage without brakes, at least for a short distance. A black SUV pulled into view behind him, its driver signaling briefly. It was the private investigator, shadowing him to ensure his safety. Michael's plan was unfolding perfectly, but the danger was far from over. Ahead, he saw the curve where Rachel and Terry had likely expected his car to spin out of control. He tightened his grip on the wheel, steering carefully, his pulse pounding in his ears. Back at the mansion, Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and smiled. A text from Terry. "Is it done?" She hesitated, then replied, "Not yet. Waiting for confirmation." William, hiding just outside the open window, saw her smirk as she placed the phone back on the counter. His stomach churned. He wanted to burst into the room, to scream the truth at her, but he knew it wasn't time. He had to trust Michael's plan. At the curve, Michael's car began to fishtail slightly, just as he had expected. He gritted his teeth, countersteering with precision. The private investigator's SUV pulled alongside him, providing a buffer in case the car veered too far off course. Once past the curve, Michael guided the car onto the shoulder and brought it to a slow stop using the emergency brake. He exhaled deeply, his hands trembling as he reached for his phone. "It's done," he said into the receiver, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Call the police. We have everything we need." Back at the mansion, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time, the screen lit up with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated but answered, her voice smooth. "Hello. This is Detective Harris with the city police," the voice said firmly. "We'd like to speak with you about an attempted homicide involving your husband." Rachel froze, the blood draining from her face. I don't understand," she stammered. "Your husband is alive, Mrs. Morgan," the detective continued. "He has evidence that implicates you and Terry Morgan in a plot to sabotage his vehicle. We're on our way to your residence now. Please remain where you are." The call ended abruptly, leaving Rachel standing in stunned silence. She barely had time to react before the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. William watched from his hiding spot as the police arrived, their cars pulling into the long driveway. Officers stepped out, their expressions grim as they entered the house. Moments later, Rachel was escorted out, her hands cuffed behind her back. Gone was the elegance and composure. She looked shaken, her face pale as she tried to explain herself. Terry's arrest followed swiftly. The private investigator had tracked him to a nearby cafe, where he was waiting for news of Michael's accident. When the officers approached, he tried to flee, but they apprehended him easily. His phone, filled with incriminating messages and photos, sealed his fate. By the afternoon, the mansion was quiet once more. Michael returned home, his expression weary but victorious. William stood in the doorway, uncertain, as Michael approached him. "You did more than I could have asked," Michael said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I owe you my life." William shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I couldn't let them get away with it." Michael smiled faintly. "Still, I can't let you go back to the streets. Stay here. This house has room, and I think we both could use someone we trust." William's eyes widened, his throat tightening with emotion. "You mean it?" "I do," Michael said firmly. "You saved me. Now let me do the same for you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media frenzy. But through it all, Michael stood tall. The betrayal had cut deep, but with William by his side, he found the strength to rebuild. Not just his empire, but his sense of purpose. And for the first time in years, the mansion felt like a home, filled with warmth and gratitude instead of shadows and schemes.